Assalamu alaikum, good morning. Today inshallah we are going to talk about the autonomic nervous system, which is part of the human nervous system. Of the current lecture are to know the organization and divisions of the autonomic nervous system, the neurotransmitters and receptors that mediate the effects of the autonomic nervous system on different organs, the effects of both divisions of the autonomic nervous system on specific organs, like the organs of the cardiovascular system, the respiratory system, the alimentary canal, and so on. The functions and characteristics of the sympathetic discharge, as well as the functions and characteristics of the parasympathetic discharge. The autonomic nervous system consists of motor neurons that innervate smooth muscles, cardiac muscles, and glands. The autonomic nervous system makes adjustments to ensure optimal support for body activities. For example, it shunts blood to areas that need more blood and adjusts heart rate, blood pressure, digestive processes, and so on. The autonomic nervous system operates via subconscious control, so it is an involuntary system. That's why the autonomic nervous system is called the involuntary nervous system or general visceral motor system. The autonomic nervous system is a part of the nervous system, and as you see here, the nervous system is composed of central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system has a sensory division or afferent division that brings sensation from the periphery, either the somatic from body surface or from the internal organ or the visceral sensations. And also the peripheral nervous system has a motor division or an efferent division. The motor division of the peripheral nervous system is divided into somatic nervous system that controls the skeletal muscles responsible for the movement of the body, and an autonomic nervous system that is the motor of the internal organs or internal viscera. The autonomic nervous system is divided into sympathetic and parasympathetic division. So the autonomic nervous system is one of the divisions of the motor nervous system, or the motor division of the peripheral nervous system. The somatic nervous system and autonomic nervous system have motor fibers and no sensory fibers. So both the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system have motor fibers, but they differ in different things. One of the differences is in the effectors that they innervate, the efferent pathways and the ganglia along the pathway, and the target organ responses to the neurotransmitters that are released by the nerve endings of these two subdivisions of the motor or efferent division of the peripheral nervous system. With regards to the effectors, the somatic nervous system innervates only the skeletal muscles, while the autonomic nervous system innervates the internal organs like the cardiac muscles, the smooth muscles in all internal organs or the wall of the hollow organs, including the blood vessels, as well as glands of exocrine and endocrine nature. With regard to the efferent pathways and the ganglia, we can see here that the somatic nervous system, there is a single neuron from the central nervous system to the effector organ, which is the skeletal muscle, and this the nerve ending of this nerve fiber always releases acetylcholine, that has a stimulatory effect on the skeletal muscles, causing their contraction. The autonomic nervous system, with both sympathetic and parasympathetic division, we can notice that it is composed of two neuron chain from the central nervous system to the effector organ. So there is first order neuron, second order neuron, and they synapse at a ganglion. So the first order neuron can also be called preganglionic neuron, and the second order neuron is a postganglionic neuron. And this is true for both sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system. The postganglionic neuron usually innervates the effector organs, as I said, cardiac muscles, smooth muscles in the wall of the hollow organs, and exocrine and endocrine gland. The effect of the neurotransmitter that is released from the endings of the postganglionic neuron could be stimulatory or inhibitory, depending on the type of neurotransmitter released and the type or subtype of receptor that is present on the effector organ. I want to attract your attention before we go to the next slide that the motor neuron of the somatic nervous system is heavily myelinated. The preganglionic neurons of the autonomic nervous system are lightly myelinated, while the postganglionic neurons are non-myelinated. So to summarize, the somatic nervous system, the cell body of the motor neuron is present in the CNS, and a single thick myelinated group A axon extends in the spinal or cranial nerves directly to the skeletal muscle. And as I said, the effect is always stimulatory. In the autonomic nervous system pathway, the pathway uses two neuron chain. The preganglionic neuron, the cell body is present in the central nervous system, the brain or spinal cord, with thin, lightly myelinated preganglionic axon extending to the ganglion. The postganglionic neuron is present outside the central nervous system. The preganglionic axon synapses with the cell body in the autonomic ganglion, with non-myelinated postganglionic axon that extends to the effector organ, which is a cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, exocrine or endocrine gland. The third difference between the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system is the neurotransmitter that is released by the motor fibers. In the somatic nervous system, all somatic motor neurons release acetylcholine, and the effect of acetylcholine is always stimulatory. In the autonomic nervous system, the preganglionic fibers of both the sympathetic and parasympathetic, they release acetylcholine at the autonomic ganglia. The postganglionic fibers usually release norepinephrine or acetylcholine at the effector, depending whether we are talking about the sympathetic or parasympathetic division. So again, all the preganglionic fibers of both divisions release acetylcholine at the autonomic ganglia. The postganglionic fibers release either norepinephrine, as the case in the sympathetic division, or acetylcholine in the case of parasympathetic division, with very few exceptions that we will mention in the coming slides. The effect of the released neurotransmitters is either stimulatory or inhibitory, depending on the type of the receptor that is expressed on the effector organs. There is an overlap between the somatic and autonomic functions. Higher brain centers regulate and coordinate both systems, the somatic and the autonomic nervous systems. Most spinal and many cranial nerves contain both somatic and autonomic fibers. Adaptations usually involve both skeletal muscles and visceral organs. So the function of both divisions of the motor part of the peripheral nervous system is well coordinated by higher brain centers. Examples: active muscles require more oxygen and glucose, so the autonomic nervous system nerves will speed up the heart rate and open the airway and also dilate the blood vessels, so the muscles will get more oxygen, more nutrients, so it can get more energy for the contraction. And here we can see the coordination between the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system, as I mentioned earlier, has two main divisions. These two divisions are the parasympathetic division, which promotes maintenance functions and conserves energy, and the sympathetic division that mobilizes body during activity, like during exercise or stress. Most visceral organs receive dual innervation, so any organ that receives sympathetic and parasympathetic fiber, we call this innervation by both divisions as dual innervation. All visceral organs are served by both divisions of the autonomic nervous system, but these divisions cause opposite effects. The dynamic antagonism between the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions maintains homeostasis because they act opposite to each other. The role of the parasympathetic division, the main function is to keep body energy use as low as possible, even while carrying out maintenance activities. It is referred to as the rest and digest system. It directs digestion, diuresis, formation of urine, and defecation, the passing out of fecal material. Example of parasympathetic division activity is a person relaxing and reading after a meal when the blood pressure, heart rate, and respiratory rate are low, and the gastrointestinal tract activity is high to promote the digestion and absorption of nutrients after a meal, and the pupils are constricted and the lenses of the eye are accommodated for close vision to allow, while the parasympathetic division mobilizes body during activity. It is referred to as flight or flight system, the fight or flight system, and it is the system that has high activity during exercise, excitement, emergency, and embarrassment. So it is the system of 4 E's. All these activate the sympathetic system. There is increased heart rate, dry mouth, cold, sweaty skin, and dilated pupil. During vigorous physical activity, the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system will shunt blood to the skeletal muscles and heart, because these organs are in great need of blood to supply oxygen and nutrient during the fight or flight activity. The sympathetic division also dilates the bronchioles, so we can inhale more air to provide more oxygen to the blood. It causes the liver to release glucose that will be used as a source of energy by the contracting muscles. There are 3 main anatomical differences between the two divisions of the autonomic nervous system. The first main difference is the site of origin of the motor fibers or the preganglionic fibers. In the parasympathetic, it is craniosacral. So the preganglionic fibers arise from the brain and the sacral division of the spinal cord, while the site of origin for the sympathetic division, the preganglionic fibers arise from the thoracolumbar divisions of the spinal cord. The other main difference between the parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions is the relative length of the preganglionic and postganglionic fibers. As you notice in the parasympathetic system, the preganglionic fibers are relatively long compared with the short postganglionic fibers. In the sympathetic division, the preganglionic fibers are relatively short, while the postganglionic fibers are long. The third main difference is the location of the autonomic ganglia. In the parasympathetic system, the autonomic ganglia are present within the organ or near the organ that they innervate, while in the sympathetic division, the ganglia are present close to the spinal cord. So these are the three main differences between the two. To summarize, the three main differences between sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. Number one, the sites of origin. Parasympathetic fibers are craniosacral. They originate in the brain and sacral region of the spinal cord. The sympathetic fibers are thoracolumbar. They originate in the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord. The second main difference is the relative length of the fibers. As I said, parasympathetic has long preganglionic and short postganglionic fibers. The sympathetic division has short preganglionic and long postganglionic fibers. The third main difference is the location of the ganglia. Parasympathetic ganglia are located in or near their visceral effector organ. The sympathetic ganglia lie close to the spinal cord. The parasympathetic division, let's talk in some detail or in more details about both divisions. Let's start with the parasympathetic division. It is also called the craniosacral division because the preganglionic fibers originate from the brainstem and run in the cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10. The sacral region of the spinal cord, S2, S3, and S4. The long preganglionic fibers extend from the central nervous system almost to the target organ, and they synapse with the postganglionic neurons in the terminal ganglia. We call them terminal ganglia because they are close to or within the target organ that is innervated by the parasympathetic fibers. The postganglionic fibers are short and they immediately synapse with the effector organ, muscle, smooth or cardiac, or glands, endocrine and exocrine. The parasympathetic division, as I said, it is craniosacral. The fibers run in 4 cranial nerves and from 3 segments of the sacral region. The vagus nerve, which is the 10th cranial nerve, contains about 90% of all preganglionic parasympathetic fibers in the body. Although the parasympathetic fibers run in 4 cranial nerves and 3 spinal nerves, but the majority or 90% of all preganglionic parasympathetic fibers run in the or are present in the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve contains 90% of all parasympathetic fibers. The parasympathetic division serves all thoracic and abdominal viscera, and we are talking about the airways, the heart, the esophagus, and all the organs of the digestive system, and so on. The preganglionic fibers arise from the medulla and synapse in the terminal ganglia called intramural ganglia. Intramural means they are present inside the wall of the target organ. Also, the parasympathetic fibers form the cardiac plexus that innervates the heart, and this plexus slows the heart rate. The pulmonary plexus that serve the lungs and bronchi. The celiac plexus that sends branches to the stomach, liver, gallbladder, pancreas, small intestine, and parts of the large intestine. So as you notice that parasympathetic fibers in the vagus nerve innervate a lot of internal organs, including the heart, the lungs, and the airways, and most of the alimentary canal. The sympathetic division is more complex and innervates more organs than the parasympathetic division. Some structures in our body are innervated only by the sympathetic division. Examples are the sweat glands that produce sweat in our skin. They are only innervated by the sympathetic fibers. Erector pili muscles, these are smooth muscles that attach to the hair follicle and responsible for the erection of hair. And smooth muscles of all blood vessels. So these structures receive only sympathetic innervation without any parasympathetic innervation. The sympathetic division is also called thoracolumbar division, as I mentioned previously, because the preganglionic neurons are in the lateral horns of the spinal cord segments T1 to L2. And these preganglionic fibers pass through the white rami communicans and enter the sympathetic trunk or chain, or the paravertebral trunk or paravertebral ganglia. So we have two chains or two sympathetic trunks on both sides of the spinal cord or vertebral column. We call them the sympathetic trunk, and it contains the parasympathetic ganglia. As we can see here in this figure, we have the spinal cord, and we have here the sympathetic chain that contains the sympathetic ganglia, and we call the sympathetic trunk ganglia. There are 23 paravertebral ganglia in the sympathetic trunk or in the sympathetic chain, 3 cervical, 11 thoracic, 4 lumbar, 4 sacral, and 1 coccygeal. The paravertebral ganglia vary in size and position and number between, and there is a variation from person to person. The short preganglionic sympathetic fibers often emerging from the spinal cord, they follow one of 3 pathways. They will enter the sympathetic trunk ganglion, and then they either synapse with the sympathetic trunk ganglion at the same level from where they emerge, or they ascend or descend through the sympathetic trunk to synapse in another trunk ganglion at a higher or lower level, or they just pass through the ganglion and emerge from it without synapsing in the trunk. And this happens only in the abdomen and pelvis, where they synapse outside the trunk in something called the collateral ganglia. As you can see here, the fibers or the short preganglionic fibers will arise from the spinal cord, and then they will run to the sympathetic ganglion at the same level, where they synapse with the long post synaptic fiber or postganglionic fiber that will innervate the effector organ. The other option is they will enter the sympathetic trunk and they either ascend or descend to a higher or lower ganglion where they synapse there, and then they will leave the sympathetic trunk through the spinal nerve to innervate the effector organ. Or the third option is they will enter the ganglion of the sympathetic trunk. They will not synapse there. They will run directly to one collateral ganglion where they will synapse with the postganglionic neuron that will innervate the effector organ. There is also a pathway of the sympathetic system that synapse in the adrenal medulla. Some preganglionic fibers pass directly to the adrenal medulla without synapsing in the sympathetic trunk. Open stimulation, medullary cells secrete norepinephrine and epinephrine into the blood. So the adrenal medulla is directly innervated by the preganglionic neurons, by preganglionic sympathetic neurons. Sympathetic ganglia and adrenal medulla arise from the same tissue. Therefore, many physiologists consider the adrenal medulla as a misplaced sympathetic ganglion. There is something called visceral reflex, and in the coming lectures you will study something called the somatic reflex. So the visceral reflex is composed of a loop or arc that is responsible for or mediate a certain reaction. A visceral reflex arc have the same components as somatic reflex arc, and these are receptors, sensory neuron, integration center or control center, the motor neuron, and the effector. There are two key differences between the visceral and somatic reflexes. So both reflexes, or the reflex arc or the visceral and somatic reflex arcs, have the same 5 components, but there are two main differences between these two reflex arcs. The first key difference, that in the visceral reflex arc we have 2 consecutive neurons in the motor pathway. We saw there in the chain on the pathway of the somatic nervous system there is only a single neuron, but in the motor pathway of the autonomic nervous system we have 2 neuron chain. So in the visceral reflex arc we have 2 neurons, the preganglionic and the postganglionic neuron. The afferents that bring information to the control center in the visceral reflex arc are visceral sensory neurons. They bring information about chemical changes, mechanical changes or stretch and irritation from the internal organs, not from the surface of the body. Examples of visceral reflex arc are reflexes that empty the rectum and the bladder during defecation and micturition. As we can see here in this figure, that these are the different components of the visceral reflex arc, where a stimulus will stimulate a receptor in the viscera, for example the wall of the rectum or the wall of the urinary bladder. Information will be sent through the visceral sensory neurons or visceral afferents to the control center that is present in the central nervous system, in the brain or in the spinal cord, and then the control or integration center will send the orders through the motor pathway of the autonomic nervous system that is composed of preganglionic and postganglionic neurons to the visceral effector, which is cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or exocrine and endocrine gland, and this will bring about the response. What are the neurotransmitters that mediate the effects of the autonomic nervous system? We have two major neurotransmitters. These are acetylcholine and norepinephrine. Acetylcholine is the same neurotransmitter that is used by the somatic motor neurons and causes the contraction of the skeletal muscles. It is released by cholinergic fibers. So any fiber that releases acetylcholine is called a cholinergic fiber. All autonomic nervous system preganglionic axons and all parasympathetic postganglionic axons release acetylcholine. So acetylcholine is released by all somatic motor neurons, by all preganglionic autonomic nervous system fiber, and all the parasympathetic postganglionic axons. On the other hand, norepinephrine is released by adrenergic fibers. Almost all sympathetic postganglionic axons release norepinephrine, except those that innervate the sweat glands, they release acetylcholine. So all postganglionic sympathetic fibers release norepinephrine, except those that innervate the sweat glands in the skin, where they release acetylcholine. The effects of neurotransmitters or the neurotransmitter depends on whether it binds to cholinergic receptor or adrenergic receptor. As we can see here, the neurotransmitter released by the somatic motor neurons is acetylcholine. It is stimulatory, as I mentioned earlier in the lecture. We can see that all preganglionic neurons release acetylcholine in autonomic ganglia and at the adrenal medulla, and all the postganglionic neurons of the parasympathetic division release acetylcholine, while the postganglionic neurons of the sympathetic division release norepinephrine, except the sweaty gland. So what are the different cholinergic receptors? We have two types of cholinergic receptors that bind acetylcholine. We have nicotinic receptors, and we have two subtypes. We have neuronal nicotinic receptors, or NN. They are found on all postganglionic neurons. So these are the receptors that are present in all autonomic ganglia, the sympathetic and parasympathetic ganglia. In the autonomic ganglia and hormone-producing cells of the adrenal medulla. And we have another subtype of nicotinic receptor. This is the muscular nicotinic receptor that is present on the cell membrane or sarcolemma of the skeletal muscle cells at the neuromuscular junction. The effect of acetylcholine at nicotinic receptors is always stimulatory. So whenever we have nicotinic receptor on any organ, then the effect of acetylcholine will be stimulatory on that organ. It opens ion channels and causes depolarization of the postsynaptic. The other type of cholinergic receptors are the muscarinic receptors. We have three subtypes of muscarinic receptors, M1 to M3. They are found on all effector cells stimulated by the postganglionic cholinergic fibers, or in other words, the parasympathetic fibers and the sympathetic that stimulate the sweat glands. The effect of acetylcholine at muscarinic receptors can be either inhibitory or excitatory depending on the receptor type at the target organ. Example, binding of acetylcholine to cardiac muscle cells will slow the heart rate, whereas binding of acetylcholine to intestinal smooth muscle cells will increase motility. The receptors are named after drugs that bind to them and mimic acetylcholine effects. We have nicotine and muscarine, which is a mushroom poison. The adrenergic receptors that mediate the effect of norepinephrine, we have two major classes of receptors that respond to norepinephrine and epinephrine. We have the alpha receptors. They are divided into alpha 1 and alpha 2. And we have the beta receptors, and they are divided into three subclasses, beta 1, beta 2, and beta 3. The effects depend on which subclass of receptor predominates on the target organ. Examples, norepinephrine binding to cardiac muscle beta-1 receptors will cause an increase in the heart rate, whereas norepinephrine binding to beta-2 receptors in the airways will cause bronchodilation or widening or increase in the diameter of the airways. Here in this table we can see a summary of the different subtypes of cholinergic and adrenergic receptors and their effects on the target, their major locations and their effects on the target organ. The sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the nervous system work in a coordinated way, so they don't work independently. So most visceral organs have dual innervation. It means that they receive sympathetic and parasympathetic innervation. Action potentials continually fire down axons of both divisions, producing a dynamic antagonistic interaction. So one division will increase activity, the other division will decrease the activity of that organ, and this is called antagonistic interaction. It works to precisely control the visceral activity. Both divisions of the autonomic nervous system are partially active at rest, and this results in a basal, sympathetic and parasympathetic tone. One division usually predominates, but in a few cases divisions have a cooperative effect. So most of the time it is antagonistic interaction, but in very few examples they cooperate and they have a similar effect on the organ. What is antagonistic interactions? It is a dynamic antagonism that allows precise control of visceral activity. Examples, or one of the examples, is the sympathetic division increases heart rate, respiratory rate, and inhibits digestion and elimination. The parasympathetic division decreases heart and respiratory rates and allows for digestion and discarding of waste. So one will increase the activity in one system while the other will decrease the activity. Now let's talk about the sympathetic tone. Almost all blood vessel smooth muscle is entirely innervated by sympathetic fibers. So this division controls blood pressure even at rest, because blood vessel smooth muscle do not have parasympathetic innervation. The blood vessel smooth muscles are under the control of sympathetic system at rest. Sympathetic tone, that is also called vasomotor tone, it is a continual state of partial constriction of blood vessels. If blood pressure drops, the sympathetic fibers fire faster than normal to increase the constriction of blood vessel and increase blood pressure. If blood pressure rises, then the sympathetic fibers will fire less frequently, causing less constriction of blood vessels or vasodilation, and this will decrease the blood pressure. This tone allows the sympathetic system to shunt blood where needed. So the sympathetic system can direct blood to areas where blood is more needed compared to. There is also something called the parasympathetic tone. The parasympathetic division normally dominates heart and smooth muscles of the digestive and urinary tract organs, and it activates most glands except for the adrenal and the sweat glands. So at rest, the parasympathetic tone dominates the heart, the digestive system and the urinary tract organs, and most of the glands except the adrenal and the sweat glands. The parasympathetic tone at rest slows the heart rate and dictates normal activity levels of the digestive and urinary tracts. These organs also exhibit a parasympathetic tone where they are always slightly activated. the sympathetic division can override these effects during times of stress. So during stress, the sympathetic tone becomes stronger than the parasympathetic and it dominates. Drugs that block the parasympathetic responses will increase the heart rate and cause fecal and urinary retention. In addition to the roles of the sympathetic division that I already explained in the previous slides, the sympathetic division has some unique roles. These include the adrenal medulla, sweat glands, the erector pili muscles of the hair follicles, the kidneys, and almost all blood vessels receive only sympathetic innervation. So they don't have any parasympathetic innervation. These organs do not have dual innervation. Other unique functions of the sympathetic division include thermoregulatory responses to heat. When body temperature rise, sympathetic nerves will dilate skin blood vessels, allowing heat to escape from the body, and also will activate sweat glands. Evaporation of sweat will remove heat from the body. When body temperature drops, the blood vessels will constrict to their resting state. Other unique roles is the release of renin from the kidneys. Sympathetic system causes the release of renin from the kidneys that in turn will activate a system that will increase the blood pressure, as you will see in the cardiovascular system and also in the endocrine system. The other unique role of sympathetic division is its metabolic effects. The sympathetic division increases metabolic rates of cells. It raises blood glucose level and mobilizes fats for use as a source of energy. We have two divisions of the autonomic nervous system, and one of division has a localized effect while the other division has diffuse effect. The parasympathetic division tends to elicit short-lived and highly localized control over the effectors. Because acetylcholine is quickly destroyed by the enzyme acetylcholinesterase present in the synapse, and you remember that the postganglionic neurons of the parasympathetic division are short because the ganglia are close to the organ, so the area supplied by that postganglionic neuron will be small. Sympathetic division effect tends to be longer lasting with body-wide effects. Why? Because norepinephrine is inactivated more slowly compared to acetylcholine, and because epinephrine and norepinephrine hormones are also released from the adrenal medulla and they are released into the blood, they will circulate throughout the body, and this will lead to longer effects or long-lasting effects compared to the parasympathetic division. The autonomic nervous system function is under control of the cerebral cortex, the limbic system, the hypothalamus, the brainstem, and the spinal cord. So autonomic nervous system is under the control of CNS centers in the brainstem, spinal cord, hypothalamus, and cerebral cortex, but the hypothalamus is the main integrative center of the autonomic nervous system activity. It is the main controller. The cerebral input will modify the autonomic nervous system, but does so subconsciously in an involuntary way. This subconscious control is because it works through the limbic system structures on the hypothalamic structures or centers. Disorders can affect the function of the autonomic nervous system, and this can result in different diseases. Many autonomic nervous system disorders involve deficient control of smooth muscle activity. For example, the smooth muscles in the wall of blood vessels. In hypertension, or where in conditions with high blood pressure, there is overactive sympathetic vasoconstrictor response to stress. So the activity for the sympathetic tone is high at rest. This will cause narrowing of the blood vessels, and in turn it will increase the blood pressure. Also, the high sympathetic tone, the heart must work harder, and the artery walls are subject to increased wear and tear, and this will lead to atherosclerosis, further hardening the blood vessels and lead to higher blood pressure. Hypertension can be treated by drugs that can relax the smooth muscles, and these are adrenergic receptor blockers. And we are talking mainly about alpha-1 receptors, and we'll study that in more details in the cardiovascular system and later on in pharmacology in phase 2, inshallah. Here in this table, I want you to know the effects of the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions on the various organs, like the eye, the ciliary muscles that affect the thickness of the lens, the effect of sympathetic and parasympathetic on the glands, on the salivary glands, on the sweat glands, and so on. In most organs, you can see that there is an antagonistic effect. In few organs, the parasympathetic division has no effect, like the sweat glands, like the adrenal medulla, like the erector pili muscles of the hair follicles, and so on. And here again, the effect of both divisions of the autonomic nervous system on the other systems, like the urinary tract, the lungs, digestive organs, and so on. And here again a summary about the parasympathetic division, the site of origin of the preganglionic fibers, the length of the preganglionic and postganglionic fibers, and the location of the autonomic ganglia or the parasympathetic, and also the origin of the sympathetic division, where we have shorter preganglionic fibers, longer postganglionic fibers, thoracolumbar origin, and sympathetic ganglia that are close to the vertebral column. Thank you very much for your patience. I hope that you grasped the knowledge and the concepts about the two divisions of the autonomic nervous system. Thank you, and see you in the next lecture.